Hello and good morning, everyone. Afternoon, evening, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to this side event for the UNEC Regional Forum on Sustainable Development, From Science to Practice, the Role of Research in Tackling COVID-19 and Achieving the SDGs. I'm sorry, I'm hearing there's an issue with the audio. 1 second. Is it okay? Okay, we're back in business. Sorry. Anyways, back to the event. We are here today for the UNECE side event for the Regional Forum on Sustainable Development. From Science to Practice, the Role of Research in Tackling COVID-19 and Achieving the SDGs. My name is Maggie Carter. I'm a research analyst at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. UNRISD is an autonomous research institute within the UN system that undertakes interdisciplinary research and policy analysis on the social dimensions of contemporary development issues. I'm delighted to be moderating this side event today among some very excellent speakers. Today's event is part of a larger initiative to create a channel through which research and knowledge from International Geneva can amplify its impact on policymaking and help to achieve the SDGs. Organized by UNRISD, the Geneva Science Policy Interface, Think Tank Hub, and Sustainable Development Solutions Network of Switzerland and the SDG Lab, and funded by the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations, the project aims to collect, synthesize, and channel evidence from Geneva-based organizations and their global partners into the high-level political forum. I'll share more about this in a minute, but first a few announcements. The session will be recorded and live streamed via the UNRISD YouTube channel, where it will remain available afterwards. You'll see that we've enabled both a chat box and a Q&A. If you have general questions, please send them. If you have questions about the event, please send that to the Q&A. And just general comments or information you'd like to share, you can send that in the chat box. For the Q&A, you'll see there's an option to vote or like questions that others have submitted. Please do so that we can see what questions most people would like to have answered in case we run out of time. And at the end of the webinar, we'll also share a short feedback survey, and we would greatly appreciate it if you could fill that in. And though many of you are joining this event today from all over the region and the world, under different circumstances, we would all be gathered in a conference room in Geneva at this moment. And while Geneva is well known as the site of many UN agencies, it's also home to a vast number of other knowledge-producing organizations, including academic institutes, think tanks, NGOs, and international organizations. And while these organizations individually have made important contributions to global efforts to move towards a more sustainable and just society, the project was inspired by the idea that in bringing these organizations together, collecting and synthesizing research and systematically channeling it into policymaking processes, specifically through the high-level political forum, the potential for policy impact could be greatly amplified. This project has its origins in conferences that took place in 2016 and 2019, which explored how research can most effectively influence policy and practice. These events help to identify important barriers to research uptake and launch conversations on how best to overcome them. In 2020, building off of the foundations put in place by this project and the networks that were established, UNRISD, with the support of the Swiss mission and partners, began developing a new approach to delivering research findings from International Geneva to the HLPF. The process began with the launch of an evidence box, where organizations were invited to submit research related to 3 themes. Those themes are human well-being and capabilities, sustainable and just economies, and food systems and nutrition patterns. These 3 themes encompass the different SDGs that will be reviewed at this year's HLPF, and we've clustered them based on the first 3 entry points identified by the Global Sustainable Development Report. After collecting research from a broad range of organizations throughout Geneva and their international partners, and we received around 100 submissions for this project, we commissioned 3 experts in each of the fields to draft synthesis reports, bringing together the research submitted and filtering this new evidence against the state of the art. The next step in this process is an open consultation meeting to collect feedback on the draft reports. and these reports will be posted on our website next week. The consultation will take place between March 29th and April 1st, and we'll be sharing details of the event in the chat and as well as by email. Following the finalization of these reports, incorporating feedback from the consultation meetings, we'll hold a series of outreach events between now and July when the HLPF will take place to ensure that the reports have the largest possible impact at the HLPF, reaching policymakers and civil society actors. Our larger aim with this project is to institutionalize this research to practice channel over the long term and bring more and more knowledge-making bodies into the process to ensure that policymaking is influenced by relevant, timely, and interdisciplinary research, of which Geneva is a prolific producer. This is a task that is more important now than ever today, as we begin the decade of action to achieve the SDGs in the face of environmental, health, and economic crises typified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Such challenges demand that we make use of all the knowledge we have available to us, and carving out a clear path for science to play a central role in policymaking is an essential first step. Before we hear from our presenters, which will give some more insight into this project and the relevant findings, especially in the context of COVID-19 and for the region of Europe, I'd like to give the floor to Samir Yeddes, who is the first secretary of the Global Affairs team of the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations, to share some words of welcome. Samir?
Thank you very much, Maggie. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to say a few words on behalf of the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva. Let me start by thanking all colleagues who have been involved and have supported this important initiative led by UNRISD and with the support of the Geneva Science Policy Interface, SDS and Switzerland, the Think Tank Hub, the Graduate Institute, and the SDG Lab. Together, we have been working since 2016 to build bridges between academia and international organizations, to connect researchers and policymakers. We organized a series of events exploring how science can be translated into policy and action. The initial discussions showed a clear interest of both researchers and policymakers to engage with each other in a structured format and on concrete issues. Against this backdrop, we came to realize that there was an opportunity to better leverage the wealth of knowledge produced by Geneva-based organizations and their partners worldwide, and to translate this knowledge into action. Therefore, we decided to launch the initiative From Science to Practice, Research and Knowledge to Achieve the SDGs. International Geneva's unique ecosystem provides an ideal breeding ground for developing such initiatives and fostering a whole of society approach. And Geneva offers a neutral and inclusive space where all stakeholders, researchers, practitioners from the private and public sectors exchange and cross-fertilize ideas with a view to taking collective action. The Science to Practice initiative is a new platform that will amplify the voice of researchers whose findings are relevant to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The objective is to provide a new channel through which research and knowledge can reach the high-level political forum, or HLPF, and impact decisions related to SDGs at national and international levels. This mechanism represents a unique opportunity for researchers to inform and influence critical political decision-making processes. The HLPF is the main UN body reviewing every year in New York the progress on the SDGs. It has a central role in the follow-up and review of the 2030 Agenda at the global level. The establishment of the HLPF was mandated in 2012 by the outcome document of the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, also known as Rio+20. The HLPF meets annually for 8 days, including a 3-day ministerial segment, and every 4 years at the level of heads of state. The forum adopts negotiated political declarations. In 2019, the political declaration called on gearing up for a decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. As we enter this decade of action, to deliver the SDGs. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, policies based on scientific evidence are more relevant and needed than ever. As a matter of fact, the current pandemic situation is very difficult and affects all countries and regions, and I guess all of us. The pandemic is testing the resilience of our communities and society. We face exceptional challenges with deep social and economic consequences. On some dimensions of human development, conditions today are equivalent to levels of deprivation last seen in the mid-1980s. The crisis is hitting hard on all of human development's elements, such as income, health, and education. It is expected that the Human Development Index will decline this year for the first time since its creation 30 years ago. So this situation clearly highlights the importance of collective action with a systemic approach based on science. It also demonstrates the urgent need for researchers to provide the multilateral system with relevant scientific insights and actionable policy recommendations. This initiative represents a humble but important attempt in this direction. So having said that, I look forward to the presentations and the discussion that will follow, and trust that today marks the starting point of a new momentum that will inspire many to contribute to bringing science to practice. I thank you for your attention and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on all this. So over to you, Maggie.
Thanks very much, Samir. That's a very inspiring call, and I share your sentiments. Our first presentation today is from Sophie Plagerson, who will present an overview and initial findings of the synthesis report that she drafted for this project, that she authored on human well-being and capabilities, which builds on the premise that health, clean environments, protection from discrimination, and freedom from poverty, enabled by strong democratic institutions and peaceful society, are essential for realizing the capabilities of all people. This report is particularly relevant for the topic of this year's regional forum on sustainable and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Sophie is a visiting associate professor at the Center for Social Development in Africa at the University of Johannesburg. She is currently based in the Netherlands, working as an independent consultant, and has been working with UNRISD on this project since January. Previously, she worked in academic and non-governmental organizations on social development and health issues in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Sophie, we're really happy to have you and hear more about this report.
Thanks, Maggie. Wonderful to be with you all. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. So I'm presenting some of the highlights from the first of the three reports that Maggie mentioned. It's the one on human well-being and capabilities. So why this cluster? In particular, includes the SDG 1, 3, 4, and 16 around poverty, health, education, and peace, justice, and strong institutions. Gender, climate action, and partnerships for the goals are included across all the different reports and the different clusters. The reason for clustering is to expand opportunities, tackle inequalities, and create conditions for everyone across the life course to realize their potential. And this clustering highlights linkages and interdependencies, which assist decision makers to address multiple goals simultaneously and to take advantage of synergies while resolving negative trade-offs between the targets. So I've taken freedom as a guiding theme for presenting the findings for several reasons. You'll see there freedom from poverty, freedom from conflict, freedom from flourish. And freedom is central to the capability approach and informs an understanding of development as a process of expanding freedoms. The capability approach to development also demands not just the removal of sources of unfreedom, but also the achievement of the freedom to flourish. Submissions to this report were relevant both to the expansion of freedom as an outcome, but also as the principal means of development through giving voice to marginalized groups. And the report covers both of those aspects. And finally, the freedom is important in the context of this presentation, in the context of COVID, where restrictions to individual freedom have sought to ensure collective freedom, but these boundaries have really been contested here in the Netherlands where I'm based, but also in many situations. And the SDGs really provide an integrated approach to promoting interdependent freedoms. So 54 contributions were submitted to the digital evidence box that Maggie spoke of by 19 different organizations or individuals on the topic of human well-being. These included published and unpublished papers and books, institutional reports, and a webinar. A large number, as you can see from this graph, a large number related to poverty, to conflict and governance. And that was particularly striking, how many, as well as poverty and human development. And a major theme which comes through from the report, which will be published next week, is that dynamics between individual, relational, and collective unfreedoms and the solutions to them are deeply intertwined. And the submissions also reflect quite a broad geographical range of countries and regions, and where helpful, I've also referred to data from other global reports just to help contextualize some of the data. So in terms of freedom from poverty, quite a number of these submissions, both country studies, but also some global level studies, drew on the International Futures Integrated Assessment Database, which has a very broad range of data series from 186 countries across many domains. And the purpose of these is to provide an integrated data analysis and forecasting simulation tool. And they've been widely used by the UNDP and European Commission, among others. Looking these kind of different reports together, country reports, several conclusions can be reached. Firstly, that countries experience different and uneven paths to progress, and several successes for each country can be singled out. For example, albeit from a low starting point, Ethiopia quadrupled primary school enrollment, halved child mortality rates, and doubled the percentage of people with access to clean water over the space of before 2015. An example from Europe, Moldova, one of the poorest countries, considerably expanded access to basic services prior to 2015. So there's these different pathways to success, but they're also quite selective in many cases. And the challenges also remain specific to each country. So despite the advances in Ethiopia, 25 million still remain in extreme poverty. In Moldova, the development trajectory will be heavily shaped by high immigration and by an aging demographic, as well as trends in governance amid deepening concerns over corruption and socioeconomic divisions. For each of these countries, the authors model alternative development scenarios for achieving selected SDG targets by 2030, and these provide a range of context-specific policy options. In Brazil, for example, the study compared 4 alternative scenarios. The first was human capabilities, the second improved governance, the third trade and investment, and the fourth an integrated push, which combined elements of each scenario. Overall, the country studies demonstrate that there is no universal solution for broad-based national development, but that some common themes do emerge. Secondly, that investments in health, education, and infrastructure are costly, but reap disproportionate benefits in human development outcomes over time. Thirdly, that comprehensive development strategies which take advantage of synergies and minimize trade-offs yield the most significant gains over time. And this was echoed in the country studies and the global studies. In terms of health and education, as these trajectories demonstrate, health and education represent both the ends and means, both ends in themselves and means of achieving well-being. And what's becoming increasingly clear is that the COVID pandemic has abruptly disrupted implementation towards many of the SDGs and threatens to reverse years of progress in health and education. In 2017, the number of people covered by essential health was estimated to be about 1/3, insufficient health facilities, medical supplies, and health workers for the surge in demand. These underline the absolute importance of progress towards universal health coverage. And 2 case studies included in the report relate to national health insurance schemes introduced in Ghana and Rwanda. In 10 years, and these really have seen improved health outcomes. In 10 years, around half their child mortality rates. And key factors to success in scaling up these programs have included the training and deployment of health workers, technological innovations, and partnerships. In terms of education, the proportion of children and youth had been declining consistently up to 2018, down to from 26% out of school to 17% in 2018. However, in the past year, school closures have affected the vast majority of the world's student population. And last year, more than 190 countries implemented nationwide school closures. Education responses have been remarkable in many contexts in terms of their innovation and rapid innovation. However, the digital divide is widening education equality gaps. Also, in terms of kind of innovation and cross-cultural approaches to education, case studies from India and Brazil submitted to the report highlighted the importance of contextualizing education within their local communities and of integrating environmental issues, providing examples of these cross-sectoral solutions at the local level. They also highlighted risks associated with kind of addressing power imbalances within communities that needed to be addressed. Trajectories of development can not only be disaggregated at the national level, since deprivation is typically concentrated among vulnerable and marginalized groups. Women, children, youth, older persons, persons with disabilities, and indigenous peoples, among other groups, often experience lower levels of well-being within a population. These limitations to their opportunities and capabilities are often linked to deeply rooted structures of social and political inequality and discriminatory laws and social norms. Many vulnerable groups do not benefit from any form of social protection. Less than 20% of older persons receive a pension, 28% of people with disabilities receive disability benefits, and only 35% of children have access to social protection worldwide, with wide regional variation. Eva Bertolotti will speak about the impacts on vulnerable groups of COVID, but I'd just like to highlight two examples that were submitted to the report of cross-sectoral policies which have contributed to addressing the needs of vulnerable groups. COVID has brought to light issues of care and gender and how closely they relate to sustainable development. And care policies span health, education, the labour market and social protection sectors, and can increase gender equality and improve the well-being of both caregivers and care receivers. Several examples are emerging, particularly in Latin America. Uruguay and Costa Rica have recently introduced universal care systems that aim to institutionalize intersectoral coordination. Examples of policies which combine social and environmental objectives and policies are also being implemented. For example, the Bolsa Verde in National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India, which also highlights the importance of legislation for protecting vulnerable groups as well, beyond just programs. Freedom from poverty is not only concerned with well-being outcomes, but also with the process of expanding capabilities. And several submissions illustrate different ways in which a human well-being approach to research and practice gives a voice to marginalized people and promotes their agency. A consultation project conducted by World Vision in 13 countries documented children's experiences of the COVID pandemic, really seeing them as actors within the current time. Across all countries, highlighted three important factors asserted that they could play a pivotal role in raising awareness on COVID-19, because in many cases they had a better education and more access to technology information than their parents and other community members. This quote highlights that there are many people who are completely unaware and do not take precautions. So we can shoot short videos to promote more awareness. We can use an online platform to upload videos with hashtags and help by doing something productive. Moving on to the second part on freedom from violence. Violence, conflict, and weak governance remain a threat to the advancement of human well-being. COVID-19 has had varied effects on violence and conflict. in many cases in a dramatic way. COVID-19 and violence against women and children. In many contexts, virus-related measures have increased women and children's vulnerability to violence in the home, with growing reports of intensified gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and abuse. A World Vision briefing estimates an increase in violence against children of between 20 and 32% during and following the pandemic. This estimate is based on surges to calls to child helplines and also on previous experiences with pandemics, for example, the Ebola outbreak. They also estimate that 13 million more children are at increased risk of child marriage and child labor over the coming years as family livelihoods evaporate. Violent conflict has had a dramatic resurgence over the last few years and is increasingly recognized as a major obstacle to achieving the SDGs. Violent conflicts have become more complex and protracted, involving more non-state actors and regional and international actors. In some countries, lockdowns did lead to short-term declines in armed conflict, but only for a short period. And forecasts by the University of Denver researchers predict an elevated likelihood of instability in 35 countries, including ones where there's ongoing conflict and new cases. And you can see that spike where previously the decline had been predicted in levels of violence. There are strong linkages between conflict and human development outcomes, both negatively and positively. And by 2030, the share of those living in extreme poverty in fragile and conflict-affected contexts is projected to reach more than 60%. And a report on Yemen showed the tragic effect of the 5-year war that has set back development by more than 2 decades. Vulnerable groups are at increased risk in situations of conflict. Women face greater risks of violence before, during, and after conflict, and children are also disproportionately affected by war. Tens of thousands of children are used by both armed groups in at least 20 countries around the world. And adolescent boys from 14 to 16, this is from a World Vision report, make up the largest group of children associated with armed groups, with children as young as 5 years being enlisted. The vast majority join because they feel they have no other options. In terms of actions for sustainable peace, a growing volume of evidence documents strategies for avoiding the onset and recurrence of conflict and for de-escalating conflict when it arises. Violence is highly path dependent, therefore as risks intensify, the options for preventing violence become more complex. The exclusion of particular groups from power, resources, services, and security on the basis of identity or geography is a key factor in most violent conflicts, and addressing grievances and inclusive decision-making are fundamental to sustaining peace. Research submitted to this review examined data from 79 civil conflict settlements in which rebel parties negotiated electoral participation provisions to compete alongside government parties in post-conflict elections. The analysis found that although post-conflict elections as a whole do not produce peace, they are associated with an 80% increase in the odds that peace endures. This is an important finding since the majority of civil conflicts since 2000 have been linked to the recurrence of earlier conflicts. Several studies also confirm in different ways the primary conclusion of the United Nations and World Bank 2018 report on Pathways for Peace, that prevention through inclusive and sustainable development is unequivocally the best and most cost-effective way to save lives and to prevent societies from descending into crisis. Lastly, freedom to flourish. The specific evidence and solutions under the dual themes of freedom from poverty and freedom from conflict support a common core of broad, long-term and structural approaches to ensuring individual and collective well-being, which combined can resist widening social inequalities by expanding opportunities and building inclusive institutions. The pandemic has clearly shown the cost of not having universal public goods. Public health systems are needed that deliver comprehensive and integrated primary health services across age, disability, location, ethnicity, and other factors. These need to be sustained. Access to health need to address related issues such as sanitation and hygiene infrastructure and ensuring access to clean water. Education should be free at all levels with trained staff and sufficient resources at primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. Ensuring a safe learning environment involves an integrated approach that engages across sectors, including government ministries, municipal service providers, labour unions, child and gender advocates, as well as parents and students. The pandemic has shown that countries that have effective health and social protection systems in place are better prepared to respond to the crisis. Before COVID, 55% of the world's population did not have any form of social protection. In 2020, 250 countries planned or implemented over 1,400 different social protection measures. However, many of these remain temporary, and some have already stopped. Institutionalized, long-term, universal and human rights approaches to social protection are key to generate synergies across the SDGs, reducing inequalities and building resilience. Good governance supports the creation of public goods and that can facilitate development, as I mentioned earlier, and helps to maintain peace. Progress from weak to strong governance entails three fundamental stages: providing security, building state capacity through revenue, creating strength and decision power for marginalized groups. Increasingly, these three stages are less sequent and occur simultaneously. Achieving improved well-being requires deliberate engagement with the rapid advancement of technology. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, big data, and other technologies are central to a growing number of responses to sustainable development issues, including efforts to manage the COVID pandemic. Technology affects many aspects of human well-being, livelihood and employment opportunities, public service provision, as well as political participation. However, technology also risks further entrenching existing inequalities. And a report on technology and sustainability documented how private companies and the largest international NGOs have the resources to create and manipulate the technologies at the heart of solutions to global sustainability challenges. Smaller and more local actors, in particular from the global south, may be left out, entrenching existing disparities in access and participation. Conclusion. Emerging this underlines the importance of strengthening efforts to ensure cross-sectoral, long-term and structural approaches to ensuring both individual and collective human well-being, with a focus on vulnerable and marginalized populations. These connections for joined-up development are relevant at international and national levels. They need to be adapted to local contexts, and they need to be tangible for individuals. Finally, going back to the theme of freedom, at one level, through lockdowns, curfews, and travel bans, many of us have experienced a temporary restriction of our freedoms to study, work, earn, socialize, and experience life as we would like to. But at a deeper level, COVID has exposed and exacerbated a pre-existing freedom crisis that precedes a pandemic outbreak, revealing that the lack of opportunity to attend school, to receive healthcare, and to live a life free from violence are the daily, enduring, and tragic reality for many millions of people. In moving forward, the SDGs keep us focused on the goals and targets to aim for, with human well-being as the plumb line. They soberly remind us that expanding real freedoms for all is a complex journey, that it requires partnerships between governments, businesses, and international and local civil society stakeholders. The SDGs promote carefully calibrated systems that expand interdependent freedoms in a sustainable manner. The SDGs attest that freedom is not attained if it is at the expense of others' present or future freedoms, especially women, children, and other vulnerable groups. Lastly, the SDGs are rooted in the understanding that not only is expanding freedom the goal, but it also the route to attaining that goal by supporting platforms for dialogue, giving voice to the marginalized, and investing in inclusive and transparent governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for that excellent presentation. Just a reminder, you can already submit questions into the Q&A box, and we will coming to that later. A little bit about Sophie's report. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be publishing these draft reports by the end of next week. And again, you're very welcome to participate in the consultation meetings, reviewing and collecting feedback on these reports. And Following these reports, we'll be launching final versions of these. Following these meetings, we'll be launching final versions of these reports and sharing them widely. So we encourage you to subscribe to the UNRISD newsletter so you can be informed of that. We're now going to turn and look at one of the projects that Sophie mentioned in the report, an example of using research to directly influence policy decisions on a critical topic. In the spring, UNRISD launched a survey collecting data about how interventions to address the COVID-19 pandemic have affected vulnerable groups in order to encourage policy responses that are more sensitive to the needs of vulnerable people and groups. Eva Bertolotti, co-author of the report, will present the main findings, highlighting in particular those relevant for Europe. Eva currently works as a private sector specialist at UNDP Geneva. She's a researcher working on sustainable development, social and environmental policy, and sustainable finance, and has worked as a consultant for different UN agencies and research centers, including UNRISD, the United Nations 75 Initiative, and the Center for International Environmental Studies. Eva, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, I wanted to first thank UNRISD for having me today. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with them and to be speaking in this important week dedicated to sustainable development. So you will see that my presentation will be really complementary to the one that Sophie has just exposed, with the main difference to have a main focus on Europe. So in the next minutes, I will try to walk you through some of the findings of the report that I had the pleasure to co-author last year with Paul Ladd for UNRISD, entitled Protecting and Supporting Vulnerable Groups Through the COVID-19 Crisis, and published in July 2020. So the report has the objective to provide real-time insights on how policies and intervention can be better designed to address the needs of vulnerable individuals, groups, and communities. And it was based on a survey with respondents mainly drawn from the network of UNRISD, which is composed of academic institutions, NGOs, UN agencies, and civil society mainly. So the survey was launched at the end of April 2020, so really in the middle of the first European wave of COVID-19. And we did the first round of analysis in May to produce the report. And then we received some further responses into June, which have been analyzed separately later. Including also this second batch of responses, we had a total of 395 entries across all regions, all the world, and at all income levels. So today, because of the context of this week, we're going to focus on those approximately 20% of responses that you can see here that have been received from Europe and a few countries in Central Asia. And leveraging those data, I will try to give you an overview of the trends and insights associated with the vulnerable groups across the 18 European and Central Asian countries that were represented in the survey. So I would like to point that this was not a representative survey to determine direct or indirect socioeconomic impacts, but was an attempt to uncover broad trends, key commonalities, and extract specific case studies and examples. So let's dive into the findings. So initially in the survey, respondents were provided with a list of interventions, and they were asked to identify how effective they have been in supporting and protecting vulnerable groups. Firstly, border closures were largely perceived as an effective strategy to prevent the spread of the virus and hence protect all people. Then school closures were seen as an effective policy to prevent the spread across Europe. But in some countries, we had the example of Spain and Hungary, there were concerns that school closures would exacerbate education inequalities because poorer households were less connected. And I think indeed that we have seen this effect clearly also from Sophie's presentation. Then particular attention has been drawn on the effects of policies on informal sector workers, ethnic minorities, and the elderly. So in the United Kingdom, a significant shortfall in support was noted for people from Black minority and minority ethnic communities, especially those working in healthcare. The impacts on older persons was also a common theme. With the lockdown of care residents, for example, was seen as coming too late in Hungary, Spain, and the United Kingdom. And finally, the efficacy of public health communication campaign was highlighted in countries such as France. Then our survey respondents from Europe also cited some differences in the support received at different government levels or in urban and rural areas. And the relationship between national, state, and local governments varied widely across countries, but some specific examples of local support emerged. So we had Finland, where there was the case of rural municipalities that organized shopping transport for the elderly, and Lithuania, where local government provided food and transport to testing facility. At the same time, it was noted across 7 European countries that it was far easier to implement and respect physical distancing in rural areas. And this was highlighted in Belgium, in particular for the rural areas of Flanders region. And instead, respondents from Italy also suggested that more cohesive and stronger communities in rural areas helped with the response. However, many respondents also referred to rural areas as having less hospital and also testing capacity. So the survey further explored whether the policies implemented affected men and women differently, with the objective of understanding when policies had gender dimensions. And 65% of our answers from Europe and Central Asia identified meaningful gender differences. And the first trend was that women's caregiver burden at home increased significantly as a consequence of confinement measures and school closures, due to activities including childcare, homeschooling, medical assistance to the sick, combined with increased working hours. And this was raised repeatedly by our respondents in Germany, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Women were also found to be more exposed to the risk of domestic violence, harassment, and unwanted pregnancies. In Uzbekistan, one respondent underlined how the lockdown is putting women's lives even more in danger. Women were more likely also to face income insecurity, lose their employment, and be at a greater risk of not receiving government support compared to men, especially when more involved in informal activities. They were also seen as facing difficulties in finding new employment, even after the crisis, as highlighted in Germany. And I think that this whole last point was very well captured in this quote from one of our respondents from Spain, which say the social and economic measures are focused on masculine labor and jobs, thus irregular and feminine work is not included, leaving marginalized women further marginalized and unprotected. Due to the gendered segregation of labor markets, women also experienced greater stress due to longer working hours and are exposed to a higher risk of contracting the virus. In fact, in countries across all Europe, a higher percentage of women work in the healthcare sector, retirement homes, and many other essential activities. And as highlighted by respondents in Finland, policies often failed to protect them. Single mothers were also struggling with both financial and childcare burdens, and their precarious economic condition emerged from responses in Italy and in France. Finally, responses generally advocated for more gender-sensitive policy design and implementation, with respondents from Switzerland also denouncing the unavailability of reliable data on gender-related effects of policies. Then we asked the survey respondents about the concrete evidence of non-government groups providing support, and findings revealed how they play a major role in the fields where the government fails to provide social assistance or in their locations underserved by public services as rural areas. NGOs were seen as the most active group, as it was the case in Italy, where the Red Cross and Caritas were described as particularly active in assisting vulnerable communities. In Ireland, there was the example of, instead of Childline and the Rape Crisis Center, which are providing assistance to women and children in case of domestic abuse. The second most important group of actors identified is composed of local grassroots organizations, neighborhood communities, and local think tanks. Here, there was the case of the Spanish neighborhood for Lavapiés in Madrid, where donations have been collected locally to provide food, cleaning, and hygiene products to families in situation of acute vulnerability. Also, faith-based groups and organizations were seen as actively engaged in assistance, often through food distribution. So, and the final question of the survey, respondents were asked what more could be done to support and protect vulnerable groups. And the first trend that emerged was linked to social protection policies, and we link it to what Sophie has just presented. And across most European respondents, it was highlighted the importance of providing support for employment and livelihoods. And this report was also felt to be relevant for small and medium-sized enterprises, including to restart their activities as the lockdown eases, and job and income insecurity for the self-employed was highlighted as important in Spain. In some countries, specific support for vulnerable groups was proposed, and the importance of establishing employment program for migrant workers, daily wage laborers, and youth was raised in Belgium. And proposals for medical assistance and translation support in migration facilities was advanced in Germany. Another point raised was the need for more inclusive and responsive institutions. Respondents stressed the need to collect available data on vulnerable groups, and this information could then be used to tailor support and services, gain a deep understanding on the influence of poverty and discrimination on mortality rates, as well as supporting stronger social impact and risk assessment. The importance of increasing institutional strengthening, transparency, and ensuring equitable implementation was also highlighted in some countries, including Hungary. And in Italy and the United Kingdom, response called for the need of more inclusive bottom-up approaches that include also representatives of vulnerable groups in policy design, decision-making, and implementation. Lastly, respondents advanced proposals regarding healthcare and medical support. They pointed to the need to have different strategies for different contexts and groups. Physical distancing, testing, and medical support need to be approached differently in rural and in urban areas. And age-responsive healthcare was proposed as a priority in Spain. The importance also to improve communication of vital information and increase public health awareness was proposed in countries such as France and Germany. So in terms of findings, this is all from my side today, but if you are interested to learn more, I would like to invite you to go on our website and download our report, and there you will also find findings from other geographical regions and from the Global South. And we really felt that these findings were important, not only in the context of the first wave, but also now and in the context of future waves as people and governments learn to live with the virus. And I would like just to conclude the quoting David Nabarro, that WHO Special Envoy on COVID-19, who last year commented during the presentation of this report, highlighting the unique challenges of this virus and saying also, oh, this is also a disease of poverty, powerlessness, inequities, and injustices. And therefore, I think that this type of research also calls for the need to address it with an equity lens in all regions of the world, including also in Europe. And this is all for me. I will give it back to you, Maggie, and the next speaker.
Thanks very much, Eva. It was really great to hear a review of these findings. And again, I encourage everyone, as Eva said, to take a look at this report. There's much more in there. This was just a bit of a highlight focused on Europe for today. Our final presentation turns to the challenge of research uptake in policymaking and how to strengthen science policy collaborations, which is really at the heart of the project. However, before we begin, we'd like to hear from you about what you think are the key challenges that prevent research from influencing policy and practice. On your screens in a moment, you should see a poll. Yes, it's there. And you can, there's a question posed. What do you think are the main constraints that prevent research from influencing policy and practice to achieve the SDGs? And we asked that you select no more than 3. We understand that all of these are important, but we would like to get a sense from you about which ones you think are the most critical ones, perhaps in the context of the current moment as well. I'll give you a moment to submit your responses. We'll leave that up for another moment in case you haven't gotten through it. We will turn first, before we see the results, we'll turn first to our final presentation. Nicolas Seidler, who is the Executive Director of the Geneva Science Policy Interface. And he will present on strengthening science policy collaborations for sustainable development. He'll tell you a little bit more about the GSPI, one of the organizers of the project, but I will just mention that they will be leading a session as well at our upcoming event in April that has been previously mentioned on behavioral insights for evidence-based policymaking. So let's hear a little bit about what they've been working on at the GSPI. Over to you, Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Maggie, for having me. Delighted to be here with you this afternoon. So let me just share my screen now so you can see the presentation. I hope that works. So yeah, thanks a lot. Very happy to be here. So I think, you know, we've seen some very excellent insights from the previous presentations around the issue of human well-being and vulnerable groups. And what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is to sort of take a step back or step away and look at some of the broader dynamics that characterize the relationship between science and policy actors around sustainable development. And hopefully that will also give you a sense on some of the topics that we plan to cover during the Science to Practice events that will happen at the end of March and early April. And as a starting point, one thought I wanted to start sharing with you is that if we look at the COVID-19 crisis and the SDGs, I think they share a common property, and that common property is complexity. They're both made of a set of interconnected challenges with a lot of interactions and moving parts. And I think that if we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really transpired early on that we were facing not only a health issue, but that we had to understand that there were variables in terms of economic, social, institutional dimensions that both, you know, played a role leading to the crisis, but were also affected by the crisis and in the responses to the crisis. Likewise, in sustainable development, I think we've all known for a while that to accelerate progress towards 2030, we need to adopt what the Global Sustainable Development Report in 2019 called a transformational approach that is based on a set of issue clusters or entry points, human well-being and capabilities being one of them, and the other clusters that we'll talk about in the Science to Practice event as well. But I think it's useful to take that step back and to realize the strong interdependencies that exist between different SDGs, different topics, and some of the trade-offs that need to be considered to be able to bring satisfactory responses to those challenges. And an example of that is that, for example, in terms of human well-being, there may be benefits from economic growth to people, of course, but there may be some types of economic growth that may affect the environment, for example. So that's the spirit of one of the table that you see on the screen that really shows the interlinkages, but at the same time the complexity that we have to deal with. One last insight from that GSDR report is the identification of different levers or types of actors that can play a role in the equation of addressing challenges that we're facing. And alongside the private sector and civil society actors, the report stresses the role of governance or policy actors, as well as science and technology, so scientific actors. And I'm going to focus more on the relationship between science and policy now. And I think that, both science and policy actors have their own tools that they can bring to the table to tackle current and future challenges. But I strongly believe that it's really the combination of both that makes them particularly powerful to address the challenges ahead of us. So in a very simplistic model of sort of science to practice, already telling you that it's too limited, but I'll get back to that. We have science on one hand, which can produce evidence, methodologies, sorry for the typo there, methodologies and technologies that may be transferred, integrated by policy actors into policy designs and decisions that, in terms of norms or programs, can have an effect on collectivities and societies. And then, from the effect of those policies, those effects may have, feedback loops back into science. But I'm stopping there because it's a very sort of theoretical and simplistic model of the relationship that we need between science and policy, and it's really not the end of the story. Actually, while producing, good evidence is great and it's a great start, it's really not enough. And one of the key questions is, and one that we've addressed in the science to practice process and events is, how is that research and science going to resonate and engage with people that make decisions and allocate resources in society? In simple terms, policymakers. And if we want policies based on evidence, we really need to actively promote alignment between science and policy. We need to go beyond sort of unilateral one-way knowledge transfer between science to policy, because we know that in many cases that is not going to really have the effect that we want on policy outcomes. Now, I mentioned alignment between science and policy. There is a very good way to create alignment, and it's one of the focus areas of the Geneva Science Policy Interface. And that way to create alignment is collaborations, and in that case, specifically science policy collaborations. And from both literature and experience, we know that, in general, there are two main reasons why science policy collaborations can create alignment and promote evidence-based policies. The first one, broadly speaking, is that collaborations can improve the relevance and usability of research outputs. In essence, if you think about processes of co-design and co-definition of research agendas, that's gonna likely lead to research that is more policy relevant, more timely, more credible, that is developed in formats that are more useful to policy actors than maybe research that would have been developed in a bubble without considering the sort of end users. Secondly, collaborations can improve the long-term relationship between science and policy. And that point is about, more broadly speaking, beyond specific projects or outputs, the repeated interactions that can happen between science and policy actors can lead to a sort of shared understanding of policy problems for scientific actors, and also awareness by policy actors of research developments, and really sort of ultimately enhancing mutual understanding of each other's fields and needs. And overall, ultimately fostering respect and trust, which are benefits that can happen with a sort of game or relationship that is repeated over time. And that's going to my last point, but as much as we need collaborations, they are not straightforward and not easy to carry, especially between scientific and policy actors who may have different professional cultures. There are different timings between research and policy. There are different incentives, etc. And by the way, I'll be very curious to hear from the survey the poll during that workshop now, what you think are some of the biggest barriers. But it's sort of well known that it's not easy and straightforward to collaborate between science and policy. And there are various ways by which we can support those collaborations. And for example, at the GSPI, we have various programs, including calls for projects, policy briefs, engaging both science and policy in the process, networking functions, etc. But one of the ways to approach it that I want to focus now is to really invest in the people and the actors that can facilitate those collaborative processes. We like to call them boundary spanners, people in academia or in policy cycles, for example, that are in a position or can work to be sort of translators between the two communities, that can be ambassadors to sort of embody that science policy mindsets. And of course, there are, beyond specific people, there are also actors that can play an interface role like the GSPI and others. So I think that it's really important to identify those people and to bring them support with the appropriate skills and building their capacity to be in a position to do that work that is actually really important in practice. And as I mentioned, that this capacity building can take different shapes and can focus on different parts. If focusing on the side of science, it can take the shape of equipping scientists with political literacy skills, network building skills, policy engagement skills. So there are a range of skill sets that we can provide and build to be able to engage more effectively with policy actors. On the side of policy, we can support decision makers to, for example, deal with information overload, uncertainty, understand how they're making decisions. For example, as Maggie mentioned, using behavioral insights for that. How to pick the best evidence when faced with a lot of scientific evidence. So it's a tough job to, again, triage a lot of evidence that comes your way. And we think that we can sort of provide support in that sense. And that's going to be one of the focus of our panel, by the way, on the 1st of April, and some of the trainings that we're developing. And lastly, as I mentioned before, there can be also interface actors that can be leveraged to support those collaborations. As I mentioned, there are like science policy interfaces like the GSPI, but also beyond that, we can look at research units within international organizations. At the EU level, the Joint Research Center comes to mind as well. There may be formal interface mechanisms like the IPCC. There are science advisors, task force in governments, etc. So there are really different ways in which that interface can take shape. So to conclude, this was really to give you some perspective on our discussion and a teaser of what we're going to be talking about and working on the 1st of April. I think that we've seen that COVID-19 really we can see it as an opportunity to sort of bounce forward towards sustainability and building resilience capabilities. I think that there are some lessons learned from the need to build resilience that will be both beneficial for future pandemics as well as sustainable development goals. So that's an opportunity that we need to seize. At the same time, we're faced with a lot of complex issues to deal with in that context. And both science and policy actors, and of course others, can really help move that agenda, and especially as they work together. And working together really requires support and promoting that role of boundary spanners that can really make a difference. So that's all for me. Thank you very much. And I've put a link to register to the events later in end of March, early April. Maggie, I'm sure you'll have better links than that to share at the end. And please don't hesitate as well to contact me directly if you have any questions or thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nicolas, for that presentation. I think it really gives people a better idea about the challenges that this project is trying to address and ways we might start to think about overcoming those challenges. And I think that that leads us into looking at the results of the poll. Yes, and here they are. So starting from the the highest responded question, the response was lack of political will for transformative change. And I think, of course, that's a challenge that's in the background of any kind of events, any kind of discussions like this about how we move forward towards a more sustainable world in the context of COVID and generally in the context of the various crises we're facing. And beyond that, we also had 62% selected lack of channels between researchers and policymakers, which speaks, of course, to this project and the void it's trying to fill, also to this concept of the boundary spanners that Nicolas mentioned. And I believe the third most selected option was disconnect between science interests and policy needs, which again, we heard from Nicolas, the importance of relevance and usability for scientific research. I wonder if I could turn to each of the panelists and Samir as well, if you might have something to offer, something to add on the topic, just to get a little, just to get your quick response to this, or if you wanted to add anything onto this question of science to practice of research uptake. So maybe we'll work backwards, starting with you, Nicolas. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Maggie. Yeah, so a quick reaction. I think, well, the first one, the lack of political will, of course, that's the, that's a more macro element that really needs to be, changed over time and in national contexts. And so I think, that's probably true. It's in practice, we'll see many people willing, professionals willing to integrate research into policies, etc. But then some of the barriers might come sort of higher up in terms of the sort of political constraints. So I think that's well taken. At the same time, happy to see that, I'm not surprised to see that the lack of channels between research and policy actors is also a big barrier. And the disconnect between science interests and policy needs. And hopefully, again, that's something on which platforms like the GSPI, but again, many others can help create more alignment over time that helps to reconnect interests and needs and connect people that are not connected before. So I think that for me, that confirms the sort of relevance of that work and the importance of it.
Thanks very much, Nicolas. Eva, considering that you've focused on COVID in the report, do you think any of these are particularly challenging for research uptake for COVID-19 recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can recognize this connection between science interest and policy needs. In terms, especially, I believe in the methodology of producing the research. So it's very important, I think, to providing time relevant research with COVID. I mean, it should be something quick. We need quick insights because the pandemic is not giving us the time to produce maybe longer research that may be, based on a longer methodology and more time consuming. So really, there's need, I think, of communication between, the policy actors and the researchers to agree on some frameworks can adapt the research and the methodology to produce quick finding and also response to the immediate needs caused by the pandemic, but without losing research quality, of course. But there is the need of this communication. So quick adaptability. We also seen, and also for policy makers, maybe being more receptive, of the ideas of the researchers and discuss with them the potential methodologies that can be adopted. So we have seen with our survey, we published it very fast. We tried to publish the report very fast to gain insights as soon as possible and to be able to apply them to the reality. Now, of course, some more months would have been useful, but it's a trade-off, especially in this moment of crisis, I think. So it really connects with the importance of align the needs both of the researchers and of the policymakers.
Thanks, Eva. Yeah, I think that question of the timescale was actually not so explicitly reflected in the poll, but of course, researchers tend to work on a very different timescale than policy, and that's certainly a barrier that we have to think about how to address. Sophie, in putting together this report, you of course had a close contact with the sort of scientific side, working to synthesize and translate, as Nicolas talked about, to create something that can be shared with policymakers. And I wonder, from your experience with this process, what reflections you have about that, how that resonates with these ideas put here on the poll, and if you agree.
Yes, thanks, Maggie. I just wanted to speak to the third point as you raised around the disconnect, and just some really positive feedback was coming through in the report. So one submission by land scientists showed their efforts to match knowledge supply and knowledge demand. And it really they were kind of taking land as a key but finite resource for achieving the SDGs and saying, how can we make our research more relevant? And the upshot was that it's really wanting to link their environmental research, but including social and gender related research into that and working cross-sectorally. So some really positive. Others, one study was called the Place Age study, and really was a model of how to include the policy application. It was 1 of 3 years of the research cycle. And I think that's also something that's really being integrated much more. So I think there are positive signs. 2 other points that came through, I think my experience is just there is this real translation process. It's not an immediate one of taking evidence that often, especially in these sort of social development issues or conflict related, which are there's often nuanced, complex findings which are deeply context specific. And so translating those into concise, decisive, coherent synopsis is a process, and just that needs to be taken into account. And lastly, just the importance of data. It's come through, obviously, through all the presentations, but just COVID has really disrupted so many data gathering offices, particularly in low middle income countries, just efforts to continue surveillance and data gathering.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Those examples, I think, can really help us wrap our head around how this works. Samir, I wonder if you had anything to add and wanted to chime in on the question of science policy uptake. And clearly there is a strong response on this question of political will.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much, Maggie. Thank you to all for the very good presentations and the interesting questions that were asked. On the lack of political will, I think it's interesting because, in my opinion, national governments and international organizations, they face issues that are so complex and interlinked. And I think this complexity was underlined quite a few times during the presentations. And national governments have to, of course, find a balance between different and competing interests. So that's why I think policy-oriented research can play a very fundamental role. in helping decision makers to make the best decisions based on the data and information available. And the Agenda 2030 is a global commitment that was taken by all UN member states. And I think it's a clear signal that there's a political will, but the issue is very complex, and it has so many facets and aspects. So there's no easy answer to make a real change, either at national, local, international levels. So that's why we need channels to bring the scientific evidence, to bring the data, the information, the knowledge that is available to the decision makers, to the political processes, and this is what we modestly try to do here, and I guess it is an example, and that others should also follow, and other ideas can come up. And finally, I just wanted to say a word on the distinction between basic science and applied research, if you will, because I think we're not speaking, when we say, in my understanding, science, when we say science, it's not about the whole of what could entail science. I mean, basic research has a very important role. It has to continue, but at the same time, many researchers have very concrete policy recommendations or findings that can be really relevant to decision making or implementing a policy, and that's why we need to better leverage and use this knowledge. We should not align science on policy as such, but we should make sure that there are scientific findings that are relevant and useful to make a change, a transformative change. We should make sure that it's well used and known by actually the decision makers.
Thank you so much, Samir. Yes, that's obviously clearly a big concern, really, is creating those linkages and finding a way to get the research into the hands of policymakers. I think we'll turn now to the Q&A. We have a lot of questions, many of them directed specifically to individual speakers, and I'll just start so we can get through as many as possible. I think first, we have a question for Eva about the survey, wondering if there were notable findings from the Global South that differed from Europe.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. So we saw, of course, a lot of common trends, like, for example, gender-related violence was really a trend that came across countries of all income levels and across all regions. But we did see also quite a lot of difference between the global north and the global south, and in particular very low income countries. And I think what emerged was that the trade-off between lives and livelihoods was even stronger for those low income countries. Because there the lockdown was less effective if not accompanied by complementary social and economic support policies. So also the gap in like the food distribution or the provision of cash transfers was really making it difficult to reinforce the lockdown in low income countries and within vulnerable communities. So some also the policy proposals for actions that emerged from low income countries, the global south, were a bit different. There was more focus on the need for food distribution and the improvement of social protection programs linked to the provision of basic services. So we had a lot of answers focused on unconditional cash transfer, social security schemes, but also about how to improve them. So not only the need to increase them in low-income sector, but also ensure that there is no misallocation. And also another point that I think that emerged more outside Europe was the need to reduce the cost of treatment. So ensuring really medical healthcare support for all. So here again, the valorization of the public healthcare system in Europe was very different, of course, compared to other countries where the public health system is not the same.
Thank you, Eva. Sophie, we have a question from Falguni Sundaram Biswa, and he asks, what are the 3 most important recommendations for policy development and reform addressing post-COVID inequalities in health?
So what's coming through, this is my reflection on coming out of writing the report, is that the priorities remain. What has been shown is the gap that's caused by not addressing them. So I think the priorities remain to focus on child and maternal health, extending primary health services, reaching vulnerable groups, and making health services accessible. I think these are the priorities that remain standing. What COVID has done is shown what happens if they're not fully addressed.
Thanks, Sophie. Nicolas, I think you've answered a question in the chat, so I'll move on to another one. So the question is, it's hard to reconcile, well, it's more of a comment, but let's see what your take is. It's hard to reconcile scientific integrity and policy relevance. It might work with purely technical topics, but when they can't be exploited for technical gain. But how does this work on sustainable development when so much is at stake?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, from what I heard today, I think it's very important to recognize the fact that, as Samir said as well, you know, often policymakers have to make, again, very difficult decisions under time constraints, and, you know, they're faced with a lot of different evidence sources, etc. So I think there is we shouldn't aim for a model of perfect evidence-based policies. A lot of people sometimes talk now about evidence-informed policies. So I think that, you know, the important is to sort of foster a culture that values scientific input, and as much as possible, especially outside of crisis scenarios, ensure that there is an opportunity and channels for scientific input to be made. But I think that, again, back to COVID, also interesting lessons learned. The scientific community was really quick to mobilize, to bring some responses, whether it's evidence or technologies around the crisis. And I think we've learned a lot as well in terms of what worked or what didn't work in terms of science policy task forces, etc. So yeah, I think it's a work in progress, and that relationship has to be adapted to different contexts, but it's really worth pursuing.
Thanks for tackling that, Nicolas. I'll turn again to Eva. Rachel Warham asks, were there any surprises in the research findings? Anything that stuck out to you?
That really depends on the definition of surprise, whether positive or negative, right? Well, what I really appreciated from the findings is that we were looking at the consequences of policies. And of course, we were expecting a lot of, you know, negative consequences, like, for example, related to women and minorities and vulnerable groups. But at the same time, we were able to see a lot of, you know, good cases, like best practice and examples of local support provided by non-state actors, so as I mentioned before, but also by the vulnerable communities themselves that came together and, you know, supported the response. So I remember examples of, you know, women sewing masks or already coming together to protect their rural environment from the pandemic. So I think the positive, the surprise that came to me from the survey is that there are already a lot of best practice, positive examples, and also in terms of policies. So we have seen that some policies were seen to be effective. Some countries have implemented them correctly, some other less, but we have to build on the knowledge that we discovered through this kind of research, and really take those best examples and improve them even more and apply them in different contexts and within different groups.
Thanks so much, Eva. Sophie, we have a question about the process, I guess, of this of assembling this document, about the level of scientific confidence that we could have in the findings of the synthesis. I wonder if you might be able to give some insight onto the breadth of the studies and what went into pulling together this work.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, that was a process of evaluating the research quality and also the scope and relevance of the findings. So it was a really broad range in terms of depth of data and scope. And so what I tried to do in sort of the first process was literally going through all and was matching whether small or large studies against other largely global reports and seeing if they were in line with those or if any differences came up. So it's really wanting to contextualize the findings. So what is presented is reliable and valid and really gives a range of small case studies, innovation, but also broad range reports.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I wonder, maybe I would pose a question that I would open the floor to whoever would like to answer it. What impact, lasting impact, might COVID have on national and global strategies to achieve the SDGs? And please just jump in if you feel like you have something to add on that.
Well, I'll jump in briefly, and I mentioned it before, but my hope is that, you know, some of the vulnerabilities that we found were sort of conducive to the pandemic and led to the crisis will be identified as some things that we should have fixed or that we should fix in the future related to the SDGs. And again, I think that you know, if you think about building more resilience to potential future pandemics, whether it's related to health, the environment, social contracts, institutions, I think, and I hope it's hopeful, but I hope that there will be a realization that strengthening societies to be more resilient to future crises will also benefit some of the goals we had set ourselves before towards 2030. So again, I hope that we can sort of take the opportunity of that crisis to renew our commitment to this 2030 agenda.
Thanks, Nicolas. Did anyone else want to engage on that, or just a broader question on, I guess, building back after COVID? Sorry, Sophie, did you unmute?
I mean, hopefully the crisis sort of re-energizes around the SDGs. I think it's just wonderful to have the mandate. And I think just the importance of looking at linkages between political, social, environmental, because we're silent. And sorry, I can see my connection's unstable. And just for me, the number of submissions that came through around conflict just really highlighted this need for looking at individual, collective, relational dimensions of well-being in concept. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Sophie. Well, I think we actually are out of time now. And we encourage you to reach out to the panelists if you had more questions or wanted to continue the discussion. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. And just thank you, first of all, to all of our speakers for your excellent presentations. Also, thank you to the UNECE Regional Forum organizers for giving this opportunity to present the project. It's kind of the first iteration of this project, and we're really happy to have this space. Also, thank you to our project partners, the Geneva Science Policy Interface, of course, Think Tank Hub, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network of Switzerland, and the SDG Lab, and of course to the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations for their generous support of the project. And thank you as well to all of you for joining us, for your active participation, your engaging questions. We really look forward to seeing you at the end of the month for the consultation meetings, where we'll present the full reports and future events. As we mentioned, we'll be continuing to have outreach events so that we can have the maximum impact with this project. Again, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter so you can find out about all of these upcoming events. And one last request: at the end of the webinar, a survey will pop up on your screen, just a feedback survey so we can see how the experience was for you and how we can improve it in the future. We really appreciate if you could fill that in. And again, thank you so much for attending and for your participation. And please stay safe.